So I've got a photo here of the tent out in the center courtyard area here. And overall the exposure is pretty good. There's a couple of little miscellaneous things here and there that I think we could probably like clean up and tune and work and play with a little bit to go through a lot of the different tools. So first I'll start just by going through each of the different tools in the toolbar over here to the left. Many of you are already familiar with the Move tool, the very top tool on the toolbar here, or hotkey V. The Move tool allows us to grab individual things that exist inside of a layer. Right now we only have the one individual layer, and so we don't see much action happening. But if I go ahead and duplicate this layer, you'll notice that I can now click and drag and move that top layer wherever I see fit. Now if I unlock my background layer by clicking on the little lock there and make sure that my box up here where it says auto select across the top is checked, then when I click on another layer, it'll automatically select the layer that I'm clicking on. So it's switching between as I'm clicking and moving. This is really kind of intuitive. This is what we would expect to happen. But a lot of times if you're moving like small minor details and you want your cursor out of the way, if we uncheck that box, no matter what layer I'm on, it'll always move. So even if I'm not on that image anymore, it's still clicking and moving that layer because that layer is currently selected. Now, each tool in the toolbar, sometimes there's individual tools and sometimes there's nested tools. And the nested tools, you can tell there's more there if there's that little flag that's in the bottom right-hand corner of the tool in the toolbar. And if you want to see what exists inside of that nest, all you got to do is click and hold down the mouse, and it'll fly out all the tools that exist down inside of that individual tool. So our marquee, we have a rectangular marquee where I can click and drag a square. Now for every tool, we can always use this top toolbar up here to make adjustments to how that tool is actually interacting with the layers inside of Photoshop. So currently this is set to have a feather. That feather, you'll notice that my outside edges, they're not perfectly straight. It looks like the corner's kind of rounded there. If I were to grab a paintbrush or a paint bucket, you'll notice that the edges are kind of feathered. They're soft, okay? Now if I were to use my marquee tool and turn the feather all the way down to 0, then I'm going to have a very straight, rigid line, okay? So aside from just using a rectangle, we've also got a circle or an oval. Now if I'm holding down the shift button, it'll draw a perfect circle. If I hold down shift and option, it'll scale that circle in place. So as we add more keys, as I'm clicking and dragging with my mouse, it changes that functionality, how it's interacting with the canvas. I can do the same thing with the rectangular marquee. If I hold down shift, it's going to draw a perfect box. If I use that option key or alt if you're on a PC, it's going to scale in place. Now we also have single row and single column marquees. These are going to be exactly what they sound like. Now you can also add to a previous selection either by selecting the second box over, and if you hover your mouse over top of it long enough, you'll see it pops up a little note and it says add to selection. So if I go ahead and select that, every time I draw a new square, it's going to add it to the previous selection. So I can build and build and build and build and build and keep adding more and more squares into this. Now I can do the exact opposite. One more square over up here, I can subtract from the previous selection, and it's going to knock it away. I can even grab the circle marquee, set it to subtract, And just because I've switched tools doesn't mean that I can't continue to alter the selection, because this is just a selection tool. So they're going to play nice with each other. Now you can also, this very last one, it's set to make your intersection your selection. That's a mouthful. So it'll only leave selected where my two selections are interacting. So you're going to notice everything that's outside of my circle that I just drew is going to be deselected, and only the squares inside of my circle are going to remain selected. Now you can also very quickly add and subtract without having to go all the way back up to the toolbar. If I just hold down the Shift button, you'll notice that my cursor gets a little plus sign next to it. That plus sign tells me when I'm holding down the Shift button that that's going to add to my current selection. And then I can work in the opposite. If I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on a PC, then it's going to change that cursor. Now there's a minus sign next to it, and so it's going to do the subtraction without having to go all the way up into that toolbar. Now the next tool down is going to be your lasso tool. Inside of your lasso tool, you have a couple other versions of the lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool and the magnetic lasso tool. Just the original lasso tool, this is, once again, another selection tool that's going to play nice with other selection tools. So I can either leave this box set, and everywhere that I draw, it's going to make its own individual selection. Or I can hold down that Shift button, and I can draw and add to the current selection. I can hold the the Option key down and subtract from that selection. Now, if you end up with these dancing ants on your canvas and you're not sure what's selected or not selected, or you just simply need to start all the way over, you can deselect everything by pressing Command D or Control D if you're on a PC, and it just gets rid of everything. Nothing else selected. Now, if I grab my polygonal lasso tool, it's not going to be as free form. It's not going to be as loose and just going wherever my mouse goes. As I click from point to point to point to point until I get back to where my original point started, it'll keep letting me make more and more selections. And you'll notice that my cursor, there's that little circle that pops up as I get back to my original point. And that lets me know when I click there, it's going to close off that selection, and then I can move on to the next. Once again, holding down the Shift key, I get that little plus sign. We can continue to add to the selection or subtract from the selection, holding down the Alt or Option key. Now the last selection tool, the magnetic lasso tool, you actually have to have a layer that has pixels on it for it to be working right. So currently I was working on a blank layer. There was nothing on it. You'll notice if I turn everything off below, there's just nothing there. So if I turn that background copy that I've got here on, and I zoom in here, maybe I want to select just along the edge of this building. As I click and start dragging, you'll notice that line is just snapping right to the edge of the building. It's doing a lot of the work for me. So once again, all I got to do is wrap back to my point of origin to finish that selection process. If I was zoomed out, I probably could have continued all the way across the top of the building here. Up the pole, around the light. Find my point of origin. And so it followed along that contrast line really nicely. Now, if I was trying to come in here with the magnetic lasso tool and select around this tree, yeah, good luck. Okay, there's not enough contrast. There's not enough color variance for Photoshop to be able to recognize those smaller details. Okay, this is going to be really easy for like large contrasty areas where there's a very clear difference between subject A and subject B. Okay, so I'm going to deselect with Command D. Now our next tool down is a selection tool. Again, it's the quick selection tool or the magic wand tool. Now I'm going to start with the magic wand tool. This was an older tool that's kind of migrated up the ranks through Photoshop, and it's kind of clunky. And we can set some of the different settings across the top here and really change how it's interacting with the pixels. Once again, you have to have a layer that has pixels on it for it to do any kind of interaction. But essentially what the tool should allow me to do is select specific areas, and it very smartly recognizes what I'm trying to select. Okay, so if I click in the sky, you'll notice that it generally grabs most of the things that are colored that same kind of blue that I originally clicked on. Now you'll notice there's this tolerance slider that's up here. If I hover my finger over top of the words and click and drag left and right, I can very quickly change and adjust that number. So the tolerance, if I turn it all the way down to 0, what that's telling Photoshop is we want only that color pixel that's being selected. So now with the tolerance from 32 down to 0, when I click in generally the same spot, you'll notice that much less got selected. So less, as a matter of fact, that it is quite literally, oh, where'd we go? I lost it. That little point in the sky. That's how strict that tolerance has changed that magic wand tool to be. So if I zoom back out, turn that tolerance up to maybe like 10, click again, you're going to notice that it's a lot more liberal with what it's grabbing. Okay. Now, the anti-alias, this is going to allow you to grab smooth edges, a smoother transition. It's going to almost look like a feather on a brush. It's going to grab part of the pixel, so you can have a nice smooth transition in between your individual selections. Contiguous, this is going to watch either the cluster of pixels, or it's going to grab everything on the entire canvas that is that color, depending upon how it's set. So right now with contiguous set, it's going to stay as close to the original cluster of pixels that I originally click. Now if I uncheck the contiguous and I turn the tolerance down, now when I click in the sky, instead of it being just a small point because it was trying to cluster to that original point, now it's being a little bit more liberal, and it's grabbing a little bit more of those pixels that are in that color range across the canvas. Okay. Now, I can even tell it to sample all layers, and it's going to select based on the pixels that exist on every single layer. So if I have blues that are existing between multiple layers, it's going to watch those blues between every single layer. With it unchecked, it's only going to be working on the layer that we're currently selected on. So right now, background copy. Now, the quick selection tool, this is the updated version of the magic wand tool. And it's really kind of scary because it's a learning tool. Literally, it learns what you're trying to select as you're making the selection. So it counts on you selecting and deselecting things and then continuing to build your selection. Okay. So currently my brush is set with the hardness turned all the way up and the size turned fairly small. I'm going to go ahead and make my brush a little bit larger. I'm going to turn the hardness down, so it's going to grab a little bit softer around my edges. Okay. I'm going to start by just clicking and dragging and starting to select the sky. And you'll notice that as I move my mouse, it's starting to learn the pixels that I'm trying to grab. But with that last movement, see how it dipped out of the sky and now we've got some of these trees selected down in here? Well, this is where that deselection process is really important, because it's going to tell Photoshop, hey, we really don't want any pixels that are this color to be selected. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, use that left bracket, and you'll notice that if I press the Option key or the Alt key, if you're on a PC, that my cursor changes to a minus sign inside of the middle of my cursor versus the plus. And this is going to start that deselecting process. So I can come back in here and start deselecting some of the pixels of the trees, of the buildings. And it's still kind of sloppy. It's not perfect. And then you'll notice my toolbar, it's already set to add to the selection instead of starting a new selection. So I can just let go of that Option key or that Alt key and start reselecting again. So it's this back and forth, select, deselect, select, deselect. I don't want my tent, deselect that. I don't want it to select the flag. So you kind of get what I'm going for there. So, like I said, it's a little bit more intuitive in the sense that you're more or less selecting where the pixels are that you want to have versus the Magic Wand tool that was just grabbing the pixels potentially anywhere on the canvas. Now the next tool down, for years I forbid anyone from using the crop tool. And that was because the crop tool would allow you to do some really wonky things. I would always suggest that you use the square marquee tool to do any of your cropping. So you'll notice that when we select the crop tool, across the top we have the same selections, or the same settings that adjust how the tool's interacting with the canvas. It wasn't until CC that this little delete crop pixels started to show up. So if this box is checked, whenever I crop, it throws those pixels away. If it goes past that history state, if you make 20 more movements after you do your crop, there's no going back. There's no getting those pixels back. They're gone forever. They don't exist. By unchecking that box, if I make some sort of crop or a change to those pixels, go back. If I grab my crop tool out again and I start to make a new crop, you'll notice that those pixels showed back up. So they're not gone forever. Now once I save and close, that's it. Your crop is committed, there's no getting it back. But so long as you're inside of Photoshop, they still exist. Okay. Now the other thing that Photoshop used to allow you to do that I thought was absolutely terrible with the crop tool is they would allow you to change the resolution. No longer do you see a resolution up here across the top. By changing the resolution, it would allow you to crop maybe a photo that you could have never printed anything bigger than a 4x6. Photoshop would allow you to crop it to blow up the size of a billboard. And it wouldn't give you any warnings. It wouldn't say, hey, you shouldn't do this. It would allow Photoshop to do that interpolation where it would just like grab magic pixels out of nowhere and cram them into your photo as it sees fit. So giving you that kind of control without you knowing is really kind of dangerous. Photoshop has now foregone that, and so they allow us to select specific ratios, and we just don't see the same resolution shift right in the original toolbar across the top. Now, that option still exists. If you know what you're doing and you want to crop with a resolution, some of these options bring that resolution bar back, okay? But for you guys, I'm going to suggest that you always just stick within these ratios. So there's the original ratio, and that's going to be what was shot on the camera. 1 by 1, which is a square. 4, 5, which is your standard 8 by 10, 16 by 20, regular print sizes. 5 by 7, this scales up to like an awkward 10 by 14 and so on and so forth. This is kind of like a good in-between crop between like a 4 by 6 and an 8 by 10. Typically grandmas and grandpas love 5 by 7s. 2 by 3 or the stereotypical 4 by 6 ratio. This is a really standard crop, so it's 4 by 6, 8 by 12, all the way up to like 20 by 30 is like the typically large print size that you can get from any of your standard labs without having to like outsource to someone else with a huge format printer. And then 16 by 9, this is your typical video crop, that kind of cinema, really long and skinny, like most of your TVs. Everything's kind of shifting a little bit more to the 16 by 9. My life still exists in 2 by 3 though. So you can set your ratio here, and you'll notice that no matter what corner I grab, it's always going to strictly stay 2, 3. And I can force it to either be vertical or horizontal just by dragging whatever direction I see fit. And then once I'm happy with wherever I've moved my crop tool, all we've got to do to commit is press our check mark up here in the top or press enter. And it just trims off those pixels. Now, you also have a couple other tools that you're not going to use in this class. The slice tool, this is going to be more for like your web design. If you're doing like page layout comps in Photoshop, you can slice it up and then carry those slices into your CSS or whatever you're doing. And then the perspective crop tool, I've not found a lot of places to use this, practical applications. I'm going to guess that this is going to be a lot more for like your architectural photography, if you're trying to fix that distortion as like a building goes to a vanishing point or something along those lines. I've seen some really, really interesting stuff done by setting perspective inside of a Photoshop document and then carrying it into another Adobe program called After Effects that allows you to play in the 3D space. You can add in cameras and lights and stuff like that, and so you can build almost a 3D looking environment out of a very two-dimensional flat image. Now, another thing inside of the crop tool that's a really nice tool for you guys to access. Remember how I showed you the leveling tool that would allow us to rotate our image based on where that selection was laid down at? The crop tool has one of those built in as well too. So this little level icon, if I click it, wherever I click and drag, that's going to set that point to be level. So if I skew this like 4.6 degrees, it's going to set that crop at that 4.6. It's going to rotate the pixels in behind it, and it's going to allow me to make those changes in terms of rotation based on that line that I laid down. So if you have a point that you can reference, like the top of this building here, I can make the top of that building level, even though it doesn't look like much of the rest of the image is level. That's now a straight line. So our next tool down, that's that ruler tool that I showed you that I was talking about earlier, that we can just simply click and drag a point and then do edit, transform, no, image rotation, arbitrary. And it'll rotate the image to that line that I just drew. But it's not going to give us that same crop. You also have an eyedropper tool, which you really won't use. Maybe if you're trying to like sample colors, trying to see what it is, if you want to use a brush and then paint something else back in. I can sample the color blue that's in the sky, and as I click and drag around, you'll notice that it's changing. And when I let go, it sets my foreground color with whatever it was that I selected. So that top 5 or 6 tools, those are all based around selection. Just simply selecting pixels and allowing you to do and change and manipulate. Now, like I said, there's all the settings that exist across the top here whenever you select any of those tools, and they're going to allow you to do 10 times more things with each of those individual tools as well too. So moving past our first line, we start getting into some of the healing tools or some of the fixing tools inside of our toolbar. So our first tool here is the spot healing brush. And the spot healing brush, this is going to be like a really quick and dirty way of like cleaning up like blemishes on people's faces, or you'll notice that there's like a dirty spot on Steven's lens here. See it kind of floating in the sky right there. It's kind of hard to notice until we zoom out a little bit.
That's an or. Come on.
So if I click my mouse, or if I make my cursor larger than the spot and then click, what it did is it grabbed some other pixels around that general area and then picked them up and set them down over top of my problem area, and then it blended them down. So I very quickly can fix that trouble spot in the sky without having to do much work. It just does it for me. Now once again, we can change the brush settings. I could turn the hardness down, and that blending is going to happen a lot smoother. You'll notice that my black dot was not such a rigid black dot, but now it's got those nice fuzzy soft edges. Now, that worked really nicely in my sky, but if my purpose was to, let's say, get rid of the flag on the top of the tent, well, if I click over top of this and I drag, it actually does a fairly decent job. I'm surprised it shouldn't have done that well, to be perfectly honest. Usually it'll drag these pixels out and like smear colors when you work up against another surface like that.
I had it to where it like made eyes go to places I didn't want it to go.
Yeah, it'll do some really wonky stuff. Let's see. I'm just really amazed.
Probably because it's blue on white. So everyone's freaking out about that now. About your clouds.
So even if I get into some of the cloud areas, it should look for recognizable patterns. And even though let's grab like a
So you
big
can
area
just turn
here.
all this into one.
It still leaves a little bit of that hint of blue kind of inside of that sky. So it's looking for some contrast areas. There's a lot of things that are happening in the background that we're not really seeing. Another water spot up here.
I think you might have broke it.
Now we have the healing brush tool. A little bit different than the spot healing brush tool. We actually have to define where it's going to grab the pixels from. So we have a little bit more control than what the other brush was doing. I have to actually set a point of origin where it's going to pick up the pixels, and then when I click next, that's where it's going to lay them down at. So if, let's see if I can get my flag back here.
Like the stamp tool.
Kind of like the stamp tool, but it's kind of a blend between the stamp tool and the healing brush, the spot healing brush. So if I select my point of origin as being this COTC flag over here, I started right on the post, and I come back over here, paint in the new flag. We'll see how well it works. Cross your fingers. It blends that flag in, and then now we've made the switch. OSU.
That's how you clone things.
You can clone. Now, cloning, there's another tool specifically for that, and it's going to be very deliberate. Pick up these pixels, set them down here. You are behind the wheel. You're at the helm, making all the decisions instead of letting Photoshop make some of the decisions for you. So the next tool down, the patch tool, this is kind of a blend between that spot healing brush and the selection tools. So I can actually select an area and then drag it over to something else, or vice versa. Select an area and then go find a spot to bring back to it. Now that's going to be controlled by either this source or destination across the top up here. so forgive me, I don't remember right off the top of my head. But if I make a selection here around this flag with it set to source, I should be able to pick this flag up and drag it to wherever I want, and it's going to do the same thing. So we can have a more deliberate movement, so we're seeing, oh, nope, I lied. It's the opposite. So I made the selection, and then I can move my cursor over to where I want to grab from. So source is allowing me to select the source, and then I plop it in. It does the same blending. Change out the flag. We'll give one to Ohio State. How about that? So I can do the opposite. If I switch it to destination, now I pick up that flag and I drag it to where I want. I can line it up and let Photoshop blend it in. Now, to the naked eye, probably wouldn't recognize that we switched out those flags, right? Devil's in the details, though. If this is something that's going to get printed really small, you might not notice those little pixels. This is going to be something that's printed 20 by 30 and it's going to be really large on a wall. You're going to want to be absolutely meticulous and careful to make sure that all those pixels line up, because those details that seem very small on your screen are going to be very large on the wall. And so you're going to see all your slop if you're not taking the time to do it right. Okay, so you can do it quick and dirty, but you got to think of the practical application of where that photo is going to go. So now there's a content aware move tool and a red eye tool. I'll be perfectly honest, I hardly ever use those. If I'm fixing red eye, I'm typically doing it with like a black brush. You guys can do a little Googling if you want to research more on those tools, but I hardly ever use them, so you shouldn't have to worry about it. The next tool down is your brush tool. We've had some experience with the brush tool already. It allows us to turn pixels on and off if we're working in a layer mask. And it also allows us to paint down any individual color that we want as well too. So I can come up here and grab this like heinous neon green, grab my layer that has nothing on it, and as I click and draw, I am drawing green all over wherever freeform I want, right? Now remember, if we're working with a layer mask, come on, Photoshop. If I'm working with a layer mask, my brush is automatically going to default to wanting to run in either black or white. So even though I had that green selected before, when I was on a layer, when I switch to the layer mask, it automatically turns that black and white. It only runs in grayscale. I can turn pixels off by painting them black. Oh, turn my opacity up here. We're not seeing anything, so I'm going to move my layer. So as I'm painting black, it's turning the pixels off. And if I press the X button, I can switch very quickly to white, turn those pixels back on. Underneath the brush tool, you also have a pencil tool and a color replacement tool and a mixer brush tool. Very rarely am I using the pencil tool, few and far between. This is going to draw a very thin, skinny line. Unlike the brush tool where you can control the size and shape and the brush tip and things like that, the pencil tool is very much just like a line tool. Your color replacement tool, very rarely do I use. If I'm changing colors, I'm using an adjustment layer, and then I'm adding a layer mask, and I'm controlling it with a layer mask where I want it to go. It's kind of sloppy in the toolbar, I think. And then don't worry about the mixer brush tool. Now the next tool down, this is going to be your clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool is going to be that more definitive, precise, pick these pixels up, set them down over here. Photoshop's not doing anything in the background. It's literally doing what you're telling it to do. So this is the most user control versus any of the other tools, the healing brush, spot healing brush, or selection tool. So this we also have to set an anchor point or a beginning spot for it to start cloning from, and then we can tell it where to clone to. Now it's important that we pay attention to the toolbar that exists across the top here, because this very last selection bar over here where it says current and below, this is going to tell us where we're sampling from. So if it's set to current and below, it will clone literally everything on every layer that exists below it. And it's only going to grab what is the most visible layer. So if I move this over here like this, get rid of our green marks, make another blank layer. So with my clone stamp tool set to current and below, it's going to watch my top layer, it's going to watch my middle layer, and it's also going to watch my bottom layer. It's going to clone from everywhere. So if I set my anchor, let's say on this lamppost here, and I start to clone in a new lamppost, now as long as I keep my mouse clicked, I've not let go of anything, it'll continue to clone. As soon as I unclick my mouse and start over, it looks like it picked up where it left off, right? But if I move my mouse over a little bit more, it's going to clone not only that first lamppost, but it'll also keep continuing where we left off over here. Now if I move over again, it'll just keep picking up, picking up, picking up. It can get out of hand really quickly, okay? So it's watching the current layer and everything below. Back up here a little bit. If I set this to current layer, my current layer now has nothing on it. So when I click and set an anchor point and start cloning, nothing's happening. There's nothing on the layer to clone, and so it's not going to clone anything. Now if I select my middle layer and I set an anchor point over here, see my middle layer is pushed off to the left. If I set my anchor point over here and start cloning, nothing's happening. It's only watching that middle layer, and only when my cursor or my anchor point gets to the edge of the frame will it actually start cloning. So it's only watching that layer.
I can't even select that with the,
You have to set an anchor point first by holding the Option key or the Alt key, and then you click in an area, and then you start cloning.
Can you change the length where the two are apart? So you can,
You just reset your anchor point.
okay.
It locks to where you set that original anchor point, and if my mouse is always or if I set the anchor point and then I start clicking 2 inches away from the anchor point, it'll always stay that same 2-inch distance until I set a new anchor point. So I'm going to go ahead and move this layer back. So like I said, I can, with my stamp tool, more precisely grab specific pixels, come and paint them down. But you'll notice that it left that kind of halo around the outside there. Well, before when we were using the spot healing and the direct selection and all that stuff, it was using that interpolation and it was kind of blending things down and making it fit right. Okay, so this is where you want absolute control of every final detail, so maybe cleaning up some of the smaller detail edges, some of the very finer points. The next tool is the art history tool. You're never going to use this, don't worry about it. The eraser tool, you should never use the eraser tool because it is destructive, it throws pixels away. Instead of using the eraser tool, we just simply use a layer mask. Because a layer mask, we can always undo what we did without going 20 steps back in the history. Just turn it off with black and white, right? The next tool down is your paint bucket tool. Nested underneath the paint bucket is also a gradient tool. So I'll start with just the paint bucket tool. If I'm on my blank layer, any color that I have selected, this heinous green, When I click, it paints that layer heinous green. Now, just the same way that we had with our magic wand tool, the tolerance, as well as the anti-alias, contiguous, and the all layers, it allows us to paint, if I select my middle layer here, over top of certain pixels that are a certain color within a certain cluster. So if I click in my sky at a 32 tolerance, it'll look somewhat like the selection that I had made with the magic wand tool earlier, only it'll do it with green. If I turn down that tolerance, much smaller area, right?
Sky.
If I uncheck my contiguous, it's grabbing more specifically the color that I originally clicked. Contiguous will cluster. The gradient tool, this is going to allow us, based on what setting we have set across these 5, across the top here, on how it's going to lay down a gradient. So right now, it's a linear gradient. It's just a line. So if I click and drag, you'll notice that depending upon how far I drag this, it changes that gradient. So if I do a shorter line, it's a much strict, tighter gradient. Whereas if I drag it all the way across, it's very feathered, very soft, very subtle. So for instance, if I were to have a layer that's darker, like this, just very quickly throw in a curves layer so that it's only affecting my background layer here, and I select the actual layer mask, now my gradient tool, it automatically changes to just black and white, just the same way that our brush tool does. And if I change my direction and paint a gradient this way like this, now that gradient becomes the layer mask. So it's almost like a neutral density filter that you've just used a curves layer to create or to fake. So I can have a really smooth gradient, really long gradient. See how it's only affecting basically the top of the photo there? This is also potentially a way that we could do a vignette. If I grab my radial gradient instead of the linear, when I click and drag, it creates a radius. Let's go the other way. So it almost creates that vignette for us. Now there's also this angle gradient, which I have no idea where you would use an angle gradient, to be perfectly honest. I think it's probably more for like texture mapping in 3D programs. Don't ask me, beyond me. A reflected gradient, which this is going to be very much like the line gradient, or the linear gradient, I'm sorry, but it is going to do polar opposite. So it's going to allow us, if I drag my line here like this, see how it gives us that like shaft of light that cuts across the image now? You can even use this. Have you ever seen a tilt shift camera where it looks like the top of the photo is blurry and the bottom of the photo is blurry, but then there's this like bar of focus in the middle? You saw there was a lot of photos of like shipyards where it looks like they're little miniature play sets, but it's actually like real footage. Those are with tilt shift lenses. Google a tilt shift lens. You'll see tons of image examples. But if I were to very quickly on this layer blur it, and then on the layer mask use this reflected gradient, I can create almost like a fake tilt shift lens effect. This might be a bad example for But see how it uses that mask and it leaves that little sliver of focus across the image right there? So the next tool down, this is a blur tool or a sharpen tool or a smudge tool. Blur is going to do exactly what it says it's going to do. It's going to blur out a specific part of the image. Sharpen is going to sharpen. Smudge is going to smudge. Once again, I feel like these are destructive editing tools, and so you should either be duplicating the layer that you're going to be making adjustments on, or making sure that you leave yourself a rope basically to climb out of whatever hole you dig yourself into by using these tools. Okay. The next tool down, dodge, burn, and sponge. These come almost directly out of the Lightroom. When you dodge an image or you burn an image, this is exposing or underexposing certain areas of the image. So in the darkroom days, you would have like literally like a piece of cardboard that you would like hold underneath the light, and you would either be dodging and burning certain areas of the image to expose the sky less time than what you're exposing the bottom part of the photo. Now we've taken a lot of the mystery out because now we've got Photoshop and we see, instant gratification, this tool's doing this. But they do exactly what they sound like they do. Burning is going to allow us to darken the image wherever we select. Burn, 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 burn. Dodge is going to start lightening the image wherever we select. Once again, these are destructive editing techniques. You're going to want to make sure that you have a duplicate layer that you can go back. And then the pin tool, the next tool down, this is going to be for making like general selections. You're not going to use this very often in Photoshop for photography class. You can make like very strict, tight, rigid selections with your pin tool. But I'm not going to teach you the pin tool. You're going to be using this maybe more towards like vector graphics or some Illustrator stuff. You can use it to make like Bezier curves and create, like your own circle selection and stuff like that. The next tool down is your type tool. You can just simply select it and start typing right onto the canvas. Path selection tool, this is going to be working in conjunction with like your pin tool and points. Your rectangle tool, this has nested, custom shape tools, line tools, polygonal tools, ellipses. These are going to be drawing general shapes. Unlike the selection tool where it was making a selection based on the shape, this is actually going to create a physical shape. And it'll be a new layer. The hand tool, this is, in my opinion, a tool that doesn't necessarily have to be on the toolbar because you can very quickly access the hand tool by pressing space on your keyboard and holding down space. And so this is how, when I'm zoomed in, if I need to move around in my image, I press space and I can click and drag and move around my image so that I can navigate to where I want to navigate instead of very clunkily trying to use these little bars on the edges and bottom. The magnifying tool, I can click and drag left and right and it's going to zoom in and out depending upon what way I drag, and it's going to zoom based on where I clicked. I'm a fan of just using Command plus and Command minus. Very rarely do I find myself using the tool. And then finally, we get down here to our color palette. The color palette, you have a foreground color and a background color. Think about it like a color and then a color in reserve. Okay? So using the X button on our keyboard, we can very quickly rotate between our foreground and background colors. And depending upon whether you're working on a layer mask or whether you're working on a layer, it's going to change whether you can actually use color or whether it's just strictly black and white, that gray scale. So if I go back onto my layer mask here, I very quickly lay down some pixels, turn something off. I'll move it so we can see what we did. Down here, underneath of the color palette, you'll notice it's this like circle inside of a square. This allows you to go into your quick mask mode. The hotkey to enable your quick mask mode is the / the button just underneath the delete key on your Mac keyboard or the backspace on your PC keyboard. You'll notice that as I toggle in and out of my quick mask mode, you get this ominous red blob that shows up. Well, that red blob actually is showing you what is on your layer mask. So if I'm using my brush and I'm painting with black, you'll notice that I'm adding to this red blob. I'm adding to my layer mask. I'm seeing a visual representation of where I'm painting on my layer mask. If I switch to white, you'll notice that that red starts going away. That's where no layer mask exists anymore. And we can very quickly toggle in and out of your quick mask mode using that same hotkey. This quick mask mode is a visual reference. The mode that exists down here, this is actually allowing you to start laying down a layer mask without having to have a layer mask. You can turn a selection into the layer mask. Okay, so back up here a little bit. If I enter into quick mask mode, see how it's painting the red down for me? And then when I'm done, it turns it to a selection versus it actually being a layer mask. So this is just a quick and dirty way without even having a layer mask turned on to be able to lay down some sort of layer mask. So I can come in here, just very quickly do the tint. And instead of it immediately turning those pixels off, it's going to give me a selection. Then if I want to add a layer mask, all I do is add that layer mask. If I move that layer, you'll see that I've now cut out my tint. And then finally, the very bottom button there, that's the change screen mode. So every time that we've done critique and you've come up here and you hit FF, this is just switching you between all the different full screen modes. F is so much easier to use than trying to use a button at the bottom of the toolbar. So there you have it, all the tools down the toolbar. All of you are probably sleeping at this point. But otherwise, like I said, always remember that the settings, if you're not getting it to work the way you want it to work, chances are there's a setting across the top that is not set the way that you should have it set. So always pay attention in both spots.